48 meters below the surface of the Persian Gulf, something was moving that had no business being there. Not a fish, not a geological event, not the pressure wave of a passing tanker, though there were plenty of those. The Gulf's surface traffic dense enough that its acoustic environment was, at any given hour, a layered mess of overlapping mechanical signatures from vessels whose combined displacement made this one of the heaviest trafficked bodies of water on the planet. What the sensor array had detected, and what the analyst staring at her display at 2:38 a.m. had isolated from that mess after 47 minutes of careful signal processing, was a propulsion signature. Compact, low power, moving at a speed too consistent for a biological contact and too slow for anything crude. It was a vehicle, an unmanned underwater vehicle, running at depth through a corridor that the Iranian naval architecture had never, in any previously observed operation, used for this kind of transit. The analyst had flagged it without certainty. She had flagged it because the signal processing algorithm she had built over 14 months of working this specific acoustic environment had learned to distinguish between the things that belonged in the Gulf's noise floor and the things that almost belonged but did not quite fit. And this did not quite fit. The flag went to her supervisor. Her supervisor looked at it for 3 minutes and called the watch officer. The watch officer looked at it for 90 seconds and made a call that moved the flag from an acoustic anomaly in a sensor network's data stream to an active contact in an operational tracking architecture. That transition from anomaly to contact took 11 minutes from the moment the analyst first marked the signal. It was 11 minutes that mattered enormously. The intelligence context that gave the contact its weight had been assembled over 6 weeks of collection that had begun when a source inside a procurement network connected to the IRGC's Advanced Systems Directorate had reported that a specific technical capability had reached a stage of operational readiness that the source's previous reporting had described as still years away. The source had been wrong about the timeline, or the program had accelerated. The distinction was academic at 2:38 a.m. with an active contact moving through the Gulf at 48 meters depth. The source's reporting had been graded and debated extensively before anyone acted on it. Sources of this type, operating inside the procurement architecture of a program that the IRGC had every reason to keep compartmented, even from its own broader organization, produced reporting that was valuable precisely because it was difficult to corroborate. Difficult to corroborate did not mean impossible. Over 6 weeks, 3 separate technical indicators had been collected that were individually consistent with the source's description and collectively more than coincidental. A materials acquisition pattern, a manufacturing facility's electrical consumption signature shifting in ways that indicated high-precision machining activity, and a shipping movement that placed a specific logistics vessel at a pier in Bandar Abbas during a window that aligned with the source's reported deployment timeline to within a margin that the analysts had characterized as operationally significant. 3 indicators, independently collected, pointing at the same conclusion. The conclusion was that the source was right. The program had accelerated, and the vehicle that program had produced was now in the water beneath the Persian Gulf. What mattered most was what the source had described the vehicle's container as being designed to transport. Not a weapon in the conventional sense. A container. A shielded container, engineered to the specific geometric and material tolerances required to safely carry radiological material through an underwater environment without producing the thermal or radiation signature that surface-level detection systems would flag. The container had been described in terms that when the technical assessment team reviewed the source's reporting, produced a conclusion that moved the entire collection effort from a watch category to an action category within 72 hours of the assessment being completed. The material the container was designed to transport was not a weapon. It was a component, a specific quantity of processed radiological material whose value lay not in its immediate destructive potential, but in what it represented as a technical contribution to a program operating under a different flag, in a different country, in a network of facilities distributed across the Bekaa Valley and the southern suburbs of a capital city that had been, for decades, the operational heartland of a proxy force that Iran had built, funded, equipped, and directed with a consistency that outlasted every political transition and every military campaign that had attempted to disrupt it. The material, if it reached its destination, would not produce an immediate crisis. It would accelerate a slow one, and accelerating a slow crisis in that specific geography, with that specific material, was precisely the kind of outcome that the relevant command structures had been explicitly authorized to prevent. The USS Annapolis had been operating in the Gulf for 19 days. Her presence was logged, her transit profile was published in the appropriate Notice to Mariners format, and her operational tasking, as far as any external observer could determine, was the routine anti-surface and anti-submarine patrol work that American nuclear submarines conducted in this region as a matter of continuous, unremarkable presence. She had not been tasked for this specific contact when she arrived. She had been tasked for it 3 days ago, when the source's reporting had been correlated with the signals intelligence product that placed a specific Iranian naval facility on a maintenance and launch preparation cycle consistent with the deployment of an unmanned underwater vehicle of the class the source had described. The Annapolis had been repositioned, quietly, in a manner that appeared in the transit log as a routine adjustment of her patrol area. She was in the right place because someone had put her there, and that someone had done it carefully enough that the placing did not look like placing. The crew had been briefed on the mission's parameters 41 hours before the contact was acquired. The briefing had been specific where it needed to be specific and deliberately general where the mission's sensitivity required it. The crew understood the operational category. They understood the authorization parameters. They understood the recovery requirement and the reasons for it, explained in enough detail to make clear why the recovery was not optional, and in enough compression to keep the compartment of full knowledge as narrow as the authorization required. A crew that understands the stakes performs differently from a crew executing a procedure whose significance it cannot fully assess. The commanding officer had made a deliberate choice to brief at the level of meaning rather than the level of minimum necessary information, and the crew had responded to that choice in the way that experienced submariners respond to being trusted with the weight of what they are actually doing. They had been ready. They were still ready at 3:11 a.m. when the sonar team acquired the contact and the operational sequence that had been waiting for 41 hours began to move. At 3:11 a.m., the Annapolis's sonar team acquired the contact independently. They had been cued by the sensor network data, passed through the coordination architecture in a compressed intelligence update 40 minutes earlier, but acquiring a cued contact and holding a cued contact in the Gulf's acoustic environment were two different problems. The contact's signature was at the lower boundary of reliable detection. The sonar supervisor designated it and began building a track with the methodical patience that his 17 years of this specific work had developed into something close to instinct. The contact was moving northeast. Its course, projected forward on the navigation plot, described a track that exited the Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz and then turned northwest along the Omani coast toward a geometry that, within approximately 60 hours of current speed transit, would bring it within the offshore approaches of Lebanese territorial waters. 60 hours was the estimate. The estimate had a margin of error that reflected the uncertainties in the contact's speed and course resolution. The margin did not change the conclusion. The contact was going somewhere specific, and specific somewhere in this context had a name. The targeting solution the Annapolis needed to act was not yet sufficient for action. The contact's depth, speed, and precise position were known within ranges that were operationally adequate for tracking, but not for the terminal guidance parameters of the weapon system that the mission authorization described. The Annapolis needed to get closer. Closer in the Persian Gulf, with the contact running a course that kept it in the shallower water near the Iranian coast's offshore approaches, meant navigating a depth profile that gave the Annapolis less vertical clearance than her crew found comfortable. The navigator plotted the approach geometry 3 times, finding the same answer each time. There was one approach corridor that balanced closing distance with maintaining the depth margin that safety required. It was not a comfortable corridor. It was the corridor that existed. The commanding officer authorized the approach at 3:24 a.m. The Annapolis adjusted her course and increased speed by a carefully calculated increment, an increment sized to produce the closing rate the geometry required, without generating a cavitation signature at the frequencies the contact's own sensors, if it carried any, would be most sensitive to. The sonar supervisor tracked both the contact and his own ship's signature through the approach phase with the particular divided attention that this kind of work demands. The attention of a person who is simultaneously listening to what is ahead and monitoring what he himself is producing. The Gulf's background noise was working in the Annapolis's favor. The tanker traffic above was generating a surface noise field that suppressed the detection ranges of any passive sensor system operating at the depths the contact was transiting. The noise that obscured the contact from the sensor network was also, to a useful degree, obscuring the Annapolis from the contact. At 3:47 a.m., the sonar supervisor reported a contact behavior change. The vehicle had altered its depth, not dramatically. A descent of approximately 9 meters from 48 to 57, moving it into a slightly cooler and denser water layer. The depth change was consistent with an automated navigation response to a bathymetric feature the vehicle's pre-programmed route had been designed to exploit, using the thermal layer boundary to reduce its acoustic exposure. The vehicle's navigation programming was more sophisticated than the source's reporting had suggested. The technical assessment team, when this data reached them in the morning's intelligence update, would note that with the particular mixture of professional respect and operational concern that characterized their work. At 3:47 a.m. in the control room of the Annapolis, it meant the targeting solution needed to be recomputed against the new depth parameter. The recomputation took 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The solution was adequate at 3:51 a.m. The weapons officer said so, in the clipped declarative language that weapons officers use when they are ready and are saying so for the record. The commanding officer acknowledged it and held for 60 seconds, running his own review of the track data and the authorization parameters that governed the employment of the system he was about to authorize. The review was procedural. The decision had been made days earlier, at a level well above his rank, and the authorization package that had arrived through the secure channel had been explicit about the conditions under which employment was authorized and about what those conditions looked like when they were met. The conditions were met. He gave the order. The weapon departed the Annapolis at 3:52 a.m. It ran at a depth and on a track calculated to intercept the contact at a point that the targeting solution predicted with the confidence level the authorization required. The weapon did not ping. It did not emit. It homed on the contact's passive acoustic signature, updating its intercept geometry continuously as the contact's own motion and the Gulf's varying acoustic environment shifted the solution. The weapon had been designed specifically for this operational environment, for the shallow, acoustically complex, thermally layered conditions of enclosed seas where the standard engagement parameters of open ocean anti-submarine warfare did not apply cleanly. It had been tested extensively in conditions that replicated the Gulf's specific acoustic profile. The engineers who had built it had understood that the Gulf was where it would eventually need to work. The intercept occurred at 3:58 a.m. The sonar supervisor reported the contact's acoustic signature ceasing in the particular abrupt way that a mechanical system ceasing under external force is different from a mechanical system shutting down in an orderly manner. He reported the secondary acoustic events consistent with pressure hull failure and uncontrolled depth excursion. He then reported that the contact's track had terminated. He said all of this in the same measured, precise voice that he used to report everything. Because in a control room at that moment, the voice of the sonar supervisor is a stabilizing element, and he understood that. The control room received the reports in a silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds before the commanding officer acknowledged and directed the next phase of the operational sequence. The next phase was the hardest part of the night. The intercept position was in water shallow enough that the Annapolis could not remain at depth and simultaneously conduct the recovery protocol that the mission authorization required. The recovery protocol existed because the authorization package had been explicit. The container, if it could be physically recovered, was to be recovered, not for evidentiary purposes, not for intelligence value, though the intelligence value of recovering the actual container and its contents was significant. For containment. The material inside the container, subjected to a pressure hull failure at 57 meters depth and then an uncontrolled descent to the sea floor, would still be in its shielded container. Shielded containers designed to the tolerances the source had described were engineered to survive significant mechanical stress. The container might be intact. If it was intact, and if it remained on the seafloor of the Persian Gulf in a corridor transited by the fishing and shipping traffic of multiple nations, the outcome was not the outcome the authorization had been designed to achieve. The commanding officer had 2 assets he could use and a time window determined by the Iranian coastal patrol schedule that the coordination architecture had been tracking for the preceding 6 hours. The patrol cycle gave him approximately 40 minutes before the nearest IRGC coastal vessel would be in a position where the operations of an unidentified subsurface asset in this area would create an unacceptable exposure risk. 40 minutes to conduct a seafloor recovery in 57 meters of water using a remotely operated vehicle that the Annapolis carried in a configuration not widely documented in any publication that addressed the submarine's standard equipment load. The ROV deployed at 4:03 a.m. It descended through the Gulf's turbid lower water column with its lights off, navigating by acoustic positioning alone, its camera systems building a picture of the sea floor in the near darkness of filtered ambient bioluminescence that the Gulf produced in its lower layers from the particular biological communities that had inhabited this depth range for longer than any human activity had reached it. The sea floor at 57 meters in this part of the Gulf was sediment covered in ways that complicated visual search. The silt accumulated from decades of river discharge and commercial traffic, churning the water column, producing a layer of fine particulate that obscured the bottom in a visual haze. The ROV's acoustic positioning system was more useful than its optical sensors for this phase of the search. The debris field was acoustically distinct from the ambient sea floor. The ROV moved toward it. The debris field from the intercept was spread across a radius consistent with the terminal event's mechanics. The container was visible at 4:09 a.m., resting on the sea floor at a slight angle against a rock formation that had arrested its descent before it could bury itself in the sediment. The container's exterior showed the mechanical damage consistent with what it had experienced, but its structural integrity appeared, to the ROV's optical sensors, to be maintained. No visible breaching of the outer sheath. The shielding appeared intact. The operator at the ROV control console, watching this on a display whose resolution was adequate and whose emotional weight was considerable, reported his visual assessment to the commanding officer in language that was precise and completely without inflection. The commanding officer acknowledged and authorized recovery. The recovery arm engaged the container at 4:11 a.m. The contact between the arm's manipulator and the container's exterior produced a brief acoustic event that the sonar supervisor tracked with the attention of someone who understood that the acoustic environment was no longer simply a tracking medium, but an exposure risk. The IRGC patrol vessel, whose schedule had defined the 40-minute window, was not yet in the area. But schedules could vary. Schedules in the IRGC's coastal patrol architecture had been known to vary by as much as 12 minutes from their predicted cycles. And 12 minutes was the kind of margin that could turn a clean extraction into a complicated one. The recovery was not fast. The ROV's arm had been designed for a different primary mission, and the container's geometry was not optimized for this kind of manipulation. The operator worked the arm through a sequence of adjustments that took 11 minutes and produced 2 moments, where the contact between the manipulator and the container shifted in ways that required recalibration before the grip was secure enough to lift. The first recalibration took 90 seconds. The second took 2 minutes and 14 seconds, during which the sonar supervisor reported a transient contact bearing northwest that resolved, after 40 seconds of tracking, as a biological source. 40 seconds was a long time to wait for a resolution when the time window was counting down. Nobody in the control room said what they were thinking during those 40 seconds. They did not need to. The container cleared the seafloor at 4:22 a.m. The ROV ascended. The Annapolis's crew watched the recovery display with the particular attention of people who had just understood that the most critical variable in the remaining operation was a time margin that had stopped being comfortable some minutes ago. The ROV reached the Annapolis's recovery depth at 4:31 a.m. The container was taken aboard through the recovery mechanism at 4:34 a.m. The ROV was retracted. The mechanism sealed. The Annapolis came to her departure course at 4:36 a.m. She increased to transit speed 4 minutes later when the depth profile allowed it. The IRGC patrol vessel entered the area at 4:51 a.m., running its standard search pattern across a corridor that the Annapolis had vacated 15 minutes earlier. The patrol vessel found nothing. There was nothing to find. The contact's debris field, minus the container, was consistent with the kind of seafloor debris that the Gulf accumulates from decades of shipping activity. Nothing on the seafloor and nothing in the water column, identified the event that had occurred here as anything other than a mechanical failure of an unidentified subsurface object whose origin and purpose would be a subject of Iranian internal investigation for months afterward. The investigation's conclusions would be classified and would not be shared outside a narrow circle. The circle's conclusions, as inferred from subsequent Iranian naval behavior patterns observed over the following 6 months, suggested that the program that had produced the vehicle and its cargo had been significantly disrupted, not ended. Programs of this kind do not end from a single event, but disrupted, set back, forced to rebuild from a point that was earlier than the point it had reached. The container was transferred from the Annapolis to a surface asset at a pre-coordinated position in the Gulf of Oman at 11:47 a.m., after the Annapolis had cleared the Strait of Hormuz on a heading that her transit log recorded as a routine area transition. The transfer was conducted while both vessels were submerged and surfaced respectively, in a sea state that kept other traffic at a distance that made visual observation of the transfer impossible. The surface assets manifest would not reflect the transfer. The Annapolis's log would not reflect the transfer. The container's existence, its contents, and its recovery would be documented in a compartment so narrow that the documentation itself was the most sensitive element of the entire operation. 48 meters of water, 1 autonomous vehicle, 1 active weapon employment, 11 minutes of seafloor recovery, 40 minutes of total exposure window. The material that had been 60 hours from the coast of Lebanon was in American custody before dawn. A container engineered to carry the seeds of a capability that would take years to reconstitute had been removed from the chain it was designed to complete. The Gulf kept moving. The tankers kept transiting. The surface of the water showed nothing of what had passed beneath it, as it never does, as it was always designed not to. Somewhere below that surface, a submarine ran quiet toward open water, carrying something that had been going somewhere and was now going nowhere at all. What the Gulf carries to the bottom, it does not return on anyone's schedule but its own. The Annapolis ensured that one particular item would not be returning at all.